Before even crossing the threshold, he knew the freighted bitterness of that backward glance, and how worthless things turned suddenly priceless the moment you left them behind. Hello everyone and welcome to the next review for Marcel Brion's Waystations of the Deep Night. First published in France in the dark year of 1942, the story collection Waystations of the Deep Night remains the best known of Marcel Brion's numerous works in the vein of the strange and the fantastic. The journeys in this volume carry the reader through surreal vistas of an underground city that appears above ground as a bizarre theatre of facades and a fire-ravaged landscape where souls turn to ash. By playing with the format of the ghost story or horror tale, Brion transforms the romantic waystations in this volume into stages on an inward journey into lucid dreams and, no less, lucid nightmares. Waystations evokes a deep night of strange encounters, enigmatic transformations, and labyrinthine journeys. A young castrato sings his heart out in a lost Baroque garden. A timeless warrior retires from battle to an uncanny final resting place. A child falls under the fateful spell of an enchanted painting. A traveller in a burned-out landscape encounters the Prince of Death. Dancing cats engage in mortal combat in the cellars of an abandoned port city. These stories give substance to Brion's claim that the fantastic comes to us in the great tidal waves of night, phosphorescent plankton drawn by dark waves that break on humanity as soon as the sun of evidence and reason has disappeared. It's been quite a while since I've read a collection like this. The strange and the fantastic, the dark, the otherworldly, the surreal, and so forth. This book, every single story evoked another story that I've already read, another author that I was already acquainted with, which I was already acquainted. Jean Ray, Maupertuis, the work of C.F. Keary, Alfred Cuban's The Other Side, Grabinski, The Dark Domain. So many stories in this collection. I think if you're familiar with those authors and you like their works, I think you'll enjoy this very much. The best way to describe this in very broad terms is that Marcel is really drawing on a species of surrealism, a mode of surrealism that is less collective and revolutionary, as the French explored. Although Marcel was a French writer, his roots and his fascination was with German Romanticism. More inward-looking, more individualistic, more about journeys and self-reflection and so forth. And indeed, as the foreword describes, these are stories about journeys, and yet they're stories about frustrated or halted journeys of lingering and dwelling. There are certain types of transformations, but there's always some kind of halting or a reluctance to engage with the fantastic or to be. It evokes Lovecraft in that there's often a retreat from the horrific and the fantastic, but there's something more ambiguous about these stories. There's something more subtle and, I would say, enjoyable about these stories compared to something like the more nihilistic and horrific visions of Lovecraft. So as I say, this collection is really all about journeys or frustrated journeys and dwelling. But it's also particularly interesting for me is that this collection is very much involved with this idea of the emergence of the fantastic, especially as a contrast to modernity, as a contrast to the overabundance of lightness and uniformity and so forth. Furthermore, being influenced by German Romanticism, there's a focus on the power of art and music in this collection. And finally, again, taking influence from Romanticism, there's a metafictional quality to this work as well, to these stories. With that all outlined, let's get into the contents of the book itself, the individual short stories. Now, for the sake of brevity, I will just be sharing a couple of thoughts about each story, but I will be going into more detail for one particular story, which is my absolute favourite, La Capitana, which you might have seen me smile as I read the back of the book, detailing the child falling into the fateful spell of an enchanted painting. That is the story La Capitana. So if you don't want spoilers for that, you can perhaps just click away after I've given an overview of what the story entails, but let's get into the book. So, the first story is actually the last story that I'm reviewing in this video, in that it's perhaps one of the most enigmatic stories, the titular Waystations of the Deep Night. I'm not going to go into as much detail here, in that I found when reviewing this book, reviewing each individual story, this story, while it contains so much promise and is so metaphysical and so symbolic, and it's perhaps the most mysterious of the stories in this collection, I think all of Brion's motifs and themes and ideas are played out well in other stories in ways that I discuss more fully. The train came to a halt with a limp sound. The rails shivered in the rain, a soft susurration. Then abruptly the rain stopped. The green eye winked once, twice, and went out. The brakes strained bitterly. A smell of soot and mud entered the compartment. I never knew the name of that town. If I suddenly decided to stop there, neglecting my intended destination, it may have been to yield to the invitation of that green eye that had opened once more and was now blinking in time like a lighthouse bulb, turning with smooth patience in its housing of oil and mercury. There was also something powerfully insidious in the intertwining of the rails that suddenly robbed you of the yen to travel, replacing the desire to arrive somewhere with a temptation to vagrancy amidst the branchings of a labyrinth that write out in lazy eights their predilection for infinity. This story, I did not expect it to go where it went. The protagonist takes a train journey, very Grabinskian train journey, and he meets a child in this strange, almost de-reified, hollowed out, torn down city where everything on the surface seems to be skeletal in structure. There's a kind of feeling that downward, beneath, underneath, has more substance than what is above. And that plays out in various ways, kind of dialectics, to use a buzzword, academic buzzword, between inner and outer, and above and beneath. That plays out through all these stories, and it's captured here. Nothing seems quite real. It's the inward that matters, I think, in these stories. There's a tragic aspect to the city. And so this protagonist on this lonely journey meets a child who takes him through this strange, hollowed out city. I've written here that and this child is very sickly, is lame, can't walk well without being in pain. Her sickness is kind of mirrored in the external architecture. So as he's travelling through these strange empty streets, this kind of skeletal architecture, he meets another character, a man, who, just like me, was out walking among the house's empty faces. His voice gave me a start when he called out to me from the depths of a church door, where he was crouched. Birds nesting in the nooks of the sculpture fluttered about and cackled with an indignation made languid by sleepiness. Very Gothic. The church looked like a piece of Brussels lace spread out against the velvet night. The filigreed rose windows gave off an impression of extraordinary fragility. The spires rose like fingers of ice, and the tall, narrow windows divided the sky into lancettes, trefoils, hearts, and flames. The night lent this architecture so unsteady a backdrop that the entire edifice seemed to pitch forward and back, such that sometimes the fantastical tracery of stone and sky seemed about to fall upon me, while at others it seemed to reel backwards, snagging the constellations on its carved ridges. Very, that is extremely evocative of the story The Cathedral of Mist by Paul Williams. But yes, the story itself, again, it plays on this kind of contrast between inner and outer and above and below, perhaps healed and sick, this contrast between two opposites. So I won't say so much other than the protagonist goes on a journey with the child and the man out to sea, very, very dreamlike. The story does not go where you think it will go. I can just say that water is the element of change, perhaps. The story is about transformation. Transformation taken by some but not by others. Very ambiguous, but I'll leave it there. So the second story, The Field Marshal of Fear. Until sunset, the plain had been as deserted and silent as usual, but with the approach of twilight, it was filled with such peculiar comings and goings that, rather than return home, I stopped at the edge of a birch grove to watch the strange commotion. It was as though a battle had just been fought in the vicinity, for numerous troops started to file past, some still maintaining the discipline of an organised retreat, while others, thrown into confusion and panic by defeat, were scattered haphazardly over paths and thickets. So this story immediately caught my attention, having the motif of twilight, in the strange scene of these troops filing past in this hilly, mountainous terrain. Without giving too much away here, what we can think of when we approach the story is a kind of weariness, a kind of fading. The figure, the protagonist, he's kind of taken into the fold of this army. He meets one of the soldiers, and he's taken to kind of a hiding place. I believe it's a barn or a converted farm. And he meets the eponymous Field Marshal of Fear, who seems to be deeply, deeply soul-weary. There's a kind of an earthiness about him. It's such there's a kind of a mossy, tangled drudgery to this character, the Field Marshal of Fear. The story reminded me very much of, this will only make sense for those of you that have played this game, but Mundoon, or Mundown. There's a character in that particular game who is very tired of war and conflict, and the story very much reminded me of that game. Similar feeling, similar motif of this weighty tiredness, this fading. I'm not going to give too much away here. The story is very much, again, one of those journeys. But is it a journey towards a beginning or an end? So the next story, The Fire Sonata, the third story. Again, as I said in the very beginning of this review, each story feels like its own world, very fleshed out, each has their, although there's overarching themes, each story has its own feeling, very, very distinct, very, very different styles even, sometimes. The Fire Sonata very much reminded me of Grabinski in that it's another story set on a train, and the protagonist meets a performer, a violinist, who recounts his experiences playing the Fire Sonata. So I read that in some reviews, people didn't enjoy the story as much as the others, and I can see why. There's more of a lightness to the story. It feels almost comical and farcical in a way, compared to the dark, ambiguous, metaphysical stories with lots of layers and symbols and so forth. But the Fire Sonata, admittedly, I did quite enjoy the back and forth between the protagonist and Oreste Pianabocci, the violinist. So I will just say that there's a kind of frenetic energy to the Fire Sonata, fitting given the title. And I wrote down at the end of the story, we should think about perhaps the true potential of an artist when relieved of his crutches. There's a kind of fire and anxiety in this artist, I kind of related to, I have to admit, but the Fire Sonata, I enjoyed it. It feels more like an intermediate story, an interlude rather, in this collection, but I still enjoyed it nonetheless. I started to play, and with that kind of instinct that puts us in tune with the house and makes us sensitive to the mood of the audience, I felt that people were impatient to see the spectacle that they'd heard so much about, and disappointed that they'd been made to wait so long. And yet I played well, better than I've ever played. When I play, I immerse myself in my sonata and become lost to everything happening around me. I don't know when it started. I was told about it the following day, and I'll leave it there. So the next story, Incident on a Journey, presents something of a challenge. It's perhaps the most ambiguous story in the collection. It's an apt name, Incident on a Journey. It's a very vague title, isn't it? Volcanoes closed off the backdrop of the landscape, their soot and flame-plumed peaks spread out in a semicircle. Calm smoke rose up from open mouths, some seeming to release their breath slowly, regretfully from between barely parted lips. On the other side of the valley, mountains with serrated edges were as naked and white as bones. Whoever's gaze followed the upraised fingers of the candelabra cacti encountered a sky of grey cardboard, the lid of a box, sad, flat, soiled by a few stray clouds. Worriedly, the traveller probed the scorched soles of his feet. Then he suddenly got up from the stone he was sitting on, his entire body haunted by the feverish heat in which the earth was smouldering. He gazed at green-coloured balls all around him, bristling with prickles, resembling a herd of hedgehogs grazing on ashen grass. Salt-sprinkled bushes were dreaming of mineral perfection. So this story begins in the first instance in a very arid and hellish landscape. The protagonist meets a horseman, and the protagonist, this traveller, instantly feels put off by the horseman. Something is off about this horseman, so he declines his offer of bread and wine. He declines, the horseman offers to take the traveller to an inn or salon, but he declines. Instead, the traveller waits until another carriage comes past, driven by a man and his wife, and as the traveller gets into the carriage, the wife starts telling a story. She was telling a story already, but she continues. I won't say too much other than we can think for this particular tale of a waking nightmare, a journey from which we perhaps cannot escape. So the carriage takes the protagonist to a salon, and from there the story really takes on a metafictional and very layered approach. I won't give too much away other than that there's a kind of mirrored quality to the story where characters he meets in the salon relate to characters he meets earlier. There's a very an almost intense sense of anxiety near the end of the story when we realise what has occurred. We can say an inescapable awakening into a troubling situation. A very existential story, a very ambiguous but well formed story. There's an almost chthonic element to the story. It goes deeper and inwards, but then there's an external movement outwards. And I know that is extremely ambiguous for those that have not read the story, but events are mirrored, and below is also above, or inside is also external. There's this repeating motif of the first story, in fact. That was Incident on a Journey. So the next story I'm not going to dwell on too much, as it was perhaps my least favourite, Dead Waters. I will say that it was my least favourite because it heavily evoked the fiction of Thomas Ligotti, who I admittedly, very few of his stories I enjoyed, from Teatro Grotesco, which I've reviewed on this channel before. It's the longest story in the collection, Dead Waters. It's also the least. It is coldly brutal, this story. I did not find much to enjoy in this at all. Some of you will know that I prefer dark fiction, strange fiction, with a lighter touch, with a positive quality. This is extremely dark and very much a chore to read. It's about a man who finds himself in a city at night, this very stagnant, decaying city, somewhat similar to the first story. And he comes across a man called Peterson, and we learn that these two had a long relationship, a connection, and they've met up for the first time in a long time. I won't say much more than that, other than that the story, as we read in the afterword to this collection, has again that metafictional quality, which again is very, very influenced by German Romanticism. The power of story, drawing one's attention to the story itself. There's this very enigmatic relationship between the protagonist and Peterson, but we come to see that Peterson is perhaps indebted to the protagonist in ways that are ambiguous, but also there's a quality of domination here. But again, this story I did not enjoy very much. There are particular scenes in an underground lair where cats are forced to kill each other, and there's suicide, and it's just it's not a very nice story to read. In contrast to that, my favourite story, La Capitana. I was very surprised reading this. I will begin with suggesting that this story very much evokes or is sympathetic to enchantment. I needn't go into enchantment, as you're most likely all aware of what enchantment is, its dynamics and so forth. This is featured on this channel quite frequently. I have a series dedicated to enchantment. It was an old house, noble, slightly decrepit, like most dwellings in that former Parliament town, where hardly a living thing was left save for great chestnut trees that renewed their youth in pink candelabra every spring, and fountains whose eternal voices sang the same joys and sorrows year upon year, century upon century. Sonorous high-ceiling rooms, somehow ardent and despondent at the same time, stirred up dreams and nostalgia. Close walls hemmed in a garden, like a miniature jungle, choked with vague notions of escape. A house like that took possession of you as soon as you stepped over the doorsill. It inhabited you more than you it, filling you by turns with enthusiasm and gloom, depending on the paths of the sun, the course of clouds, the sudden or furtive entrance of night. It presented one of those traps where the deceptive safety of an open door hid the impossibility of later turning back. It proffered a baited hook, disguised as a rose in a crystal vase, a ceiling with stucco volutes, shepherds playing instruments over the doors, acrobat monkeys tucked away in an alcove. The magic of the house was such that it made you forget the portion of time and space you belonged to, offering instead a lure of illusory infinity. Quite quite an ornate paragraph there, but this story instantly reminded me of Piranesi. And also, I believe it will, from what I've read of it already, Little Big by John Crowley, which I've yet to read. There's a phrase in Little Big which says, the deeper in you go, the larger things become, essentially, the greater the mystery becomes. And already we're getting hints at the dynamics of enchantment. It inhabited you more than you it. The magic of the house was such that it made you forget the portion of time and space you belong to, this illusory infinity. Time slows down when you're enchanted. So this story features a child protagonist, young boy, an imaginative young boy, and I have to say I instantly gravitate towards stories like this so much more than a story like Dead Waters. There's a kind of a likability to this character. It's a more positive story. It's a bittersweet story. There's this house, the chateau, and the main motif here is of change, of dynamism, particularly how the light plays upon these painted canvases, the fascinating world of the painted canvases. They took up so much of the wall that one ended up doubting there was actually a wall there behind these seas, woods and mountains. A half-light filled the beaches and clearings, halting the bob of rowboats and the march of loaded mules along winding pathways. A cataract was suddenly delivered from stillness when the sun thawed its frost of shadow. Waves began to move once more the moment a ray of noon rekindled their moonlight. There were, as well, confused creatures and mysterious characters who, with their unsettling presence, seemed to consider the salon their own home, where all visitors felt themselves barely tolerated. The day the grown-ups were taking in guests. That day, known simply as the day, as if the others were but a long dark interlude, preparation and retreat, conducive to its splendour. That day, the 3 tall windows were thrown noisily open, shutters folded against the gilded wall, and the sun bounded into the room. In one fell swoop, the magic of the painted canvases was extinguished. Driven back by the violent light, it sought refuge in the usual depths, which hastily closed scene after scene like doors locking against an unwelcome visitor. All that remained were conventional landscapes rendered rather awkwardly, flaking in some spots and clumsily retouched in others. Something vanished behind an iron curtain that had suddenly descended, something elusive, evasive, which went to ground in layers where none could follow. The child, made to come at tea time and pass from hand to hand, mouth to mouth, perfume to perfume, and a rustle of dresses, and the light cooing laughter of women, sought in vain the familiar views. The dark tracks where tanned mule drivers and pirates in red scarves stood ready to serve seekers of fortune. There's so much there. The mysterious half-light, the conditions of silence and the flickering, mysterious half-light that makes these painted canvases, tapestries come to life. I might have been saying canvases this entire time. Painted tapestries come to life. And as soon as there is an overabundance of light, violent light and noise, an iron curtain descends and the elusive and the evasive fades away. No miracle would ever manifest itself in broad daylight or under bright lamps in the presence of those smiling women, the guests in the house. The child felt some marvellous happenstance kept access to its secrets for him alone, and that a certain quality of silence was essential to the lives of mysteries. So thinking, he grew quiet, perhaps because he didn't know what words to use to reveal the indefinable. So this story is about the imaginative encounter of a boy with one particular tapestry, the scene of La Capitana, the ship, helmed by a strange captain. This is one of the stories I've ever read that comes close to the notions I included in The Gate, this essay, The Gate, that I wrote for Reliquie, which features on this channel. It also is very reminiscent of The Door on the Wall by H.G. Wells, also reviewed on this channel. It's a story about another world, experiencing another world through art, becoming so deeply invested in it that it almost seems to come alive. So again, this particular review of this story is going to cover more spoilers, so this story also reminded me of The Wonderful Window by Dunsany, one of my favourite authors, of course, and one of my favourite short stories, about a clerk of London who looks through a window into a medieval city that comes alive for him. and he almost inhabits it, and it changes him. And so for this review of the story, I'm going to be giving more spoilers. So the tapestry of the La Capitana comes alive for this child. He catches the tapestry shifting, its scenery changing. The ship is no longer there one night. Figures move. It has its own inner consistency, its own world, and the boy becomes so deeply attached to it that he loses himself. He is not capable of living in the grey and leafless world, as Tolkien said. He wants so deeply to enter this other world that, well, I'll just read you the end. He could not have told anyone why he loathed leaving the painted tapestries in the salon. The most loving of mothers wouldn't have understood. For grown-ups, every tantrum had to have a reason, and the child didn't feel up to explaining what kept him in the salon all day long. For the pleasure he took in contemplating the paintings was now mingled with some inexpressible fear, like the fear that comes over you when your fondest wishes are to be fulfilled. Usually dreamy, he now became morose and taciturn. He'd grown pale and no longer ate. The heat, they said. In reality, it was a heavy responsibility he bore in his heart. The obligation to choose. He had already strayed too far afield to freely return. There are desertions you pay for, day after day, till you die. He returned almost regretfully to the painted canvases. They now meant more remorse than desire to him, and he was hard put to sort out whether that came from his having put too much into this desire or too little. He would miss a great many things: the neighbour's calico cat, the chestnut trees in the garden, the fountains, the house, his parents. Just as he was about to leave the world that had been his, a vague sadness made him hesitate. Perhaps a premonition of later nostalgia. Before even crossing the threshold, he knew the freighted bitterness of that backward glance, and how worthless things turned suddenly priceless the moment you left them behind. And I'll leave it there. So the penultimate story, The Glass Organ, another very romantic story. The central object of this story is a glass organ, a strange, almost ethereal instrument, which was bought by the previous owner of the estate, I believe, and it is being shown to the protagonist by a friend of the protagonist, both lovers of music. Two characters are standing in a pavilion discussing this strange instrument that's lying before them, and the friend of the protagonist does not want to dwell on this glass organ. It's got too much of a loaded story behind it, a history. However, the protagonist goes for a wander at night, another night journey. And I will just say here, I'm going to give a couple of more spoilers here for this story, because it deals with the emergence of the fantastic. I love scenes like this. The protagonist is wandering through a very bare landscape of just a rolling lawn. There's no trees or anything. But all of a sudden he begins to smell roses. He hears sounds, and he's kind of walked into almost a pocket, an island of the fantastic, and that's something I love with Dunsany's works in particular. It's almost like a polder. It's kind of a boundary between the real and the fantastic, or the mundane and the fantastic. And the landscape metamorphizes and becomes not this uniform lawn, but this grand, baroque, delicate, a profusion of statues and mazes, and it seems there's like an elemental quality to this shift. And in fact, I'll read where it changes here. Forms that were still undecided floated, trembled. They seemed torn between a desire for the immobility of a solid substance and the indolence of things that would be just as happy with an appearance muddled in mist. Statues swayed as though they were their own reflection in a pond, before rediscovering a marble stolidity. An opaque grey tissue still covered the silhouettes until their surfaces became clearly differentiated according to shadow and light. Before the stairway steps had achieved their unmoving profile, all that oscillating architecture, stirred by the wind, still seemed unsure of its definitive metamorphosis. Very much like Paul Williams' The Cathedral of Mist. This transformation of the scenery takes the protagonist elsewhere, and he finds out the history and the reason, rather, for the reticence of his friend in talking about the glass organ. Very moving, very touching end to a story. Very, very bittersweet, very sad. It's about I suppose it's about the relationship or the difference between music as play and music as domination. This reminded me of the scene in the Silmarillion with Luthien and Luthien enchanting Morgoth. So the story of the Lost Street, which instantly reminded me of Dunsany's body of work, is the final story. I'm not going to go so much into this in that I felt it was a bit, I don't know, after reading the other stories, it felt just a little bit too simple. For a start, on the surface, the language wasn't as ornate and interesting. And also it didn't really catch my attention. The story is about a man who is staying in a kind of an old rundown block of buildings, and yet there are traces of medieval architecture, ribbed vaults and so forth in these hangars. There used to be a place of industry, but now it's all gone quiet. There's no longer any business here, but he's staying in a residential area. And on a wander one night, he looked through a window and sees a street with strange inhabitants, and he doesn't understand the location, the situation of this street. It's very surreal the way he describes it, and it instantly reminded me of Dunsany in that, for example, this is written in the first person. I could apply myself to it, to finding the street, as much as I needed without ever worrying about getting lost, and yet I admit that there were moments when I felt myself very close to certain mysterious frontiers, as though I had reached the boundary where our ordinary universe perhaps encounters another world, an unknown, troubling, forbidding one, not only juxtaposed with ours, but possessing strange enclaves and infringing bizarrely on our own terrain. I cannot get across how close that is to Dunsany's model of fiction, particularly one scholar's interpretation of Dunsany's fiction, the third hemisphere. This geography superimposing the fantastic upon the mundane. That is so close to Dunsany, it's unbelievable. Suffice it to say, the protagonist goes on somewhat of an investigative journey to figure out the meaning behind this street. It's worth a read. I just didn't find it as interesting as the other stories. So as you'll be able to tell by the length of this review, I did enjoy Waystations of the Deep Night, gained much from it, and I highly recommend it as well. Thanks for watching, everyone. Until next time.